Welcome back to what promises to be another exciting video, Fireside Chats with Brad. Thanks to all the people who've been watching. Please, if you enjoy these videos, like them, subscribe them, and share them with others. It does help the algorithm, apparently. This particular subject matter we're going to be talking about today is an interesting one. It's one I find fascinating. It's one that could rub some people the wrong ways, so just fair warning on that. But I do think it's an important conversation to have, and it's going to require breaking down a lot of Western history because we're going to look at what I like to call the curious correlations between the occult and evangelicalism, or specifically the Christian evangelical church. So we're going to have to sort of time travel here and look at various movements throughout history, and hopefully I can expose some of these curious correlations. So pay attention and follow along. I was trying to think of the best way to sort of open up this subject matter, and I thought I would share a story. It's the story of the Necronomicon. Now, a lot of people probably aren't familiar with the Necronomicon, and that's not a bad thing. But anyone who has perused or explored the occult in the last century has probably come across the Necronomicon. Now, I should say, again, another caveat before we get too far down this road. I will be showing a lot of occult texts. Now, I am not doing this because I'm trying to promote these works, nor am I trying to encourage people to go out and read them. I have them in my personal library because I do read them for more research purposes. Because of my philosophical training, I was always taught, before you make conclusions about things, you need to read the original source. So I'm very much a primary source person. So a lot of this material is just because I wanted the primary sources before I, formulated opinions on these things. So I just say that, again, just as a caveat. But if you have ever heard of the Necronomicon, it could be from popular movies, horror movies, or more than likely, it actually comes from the very now famous fictional writer by the name of H.P. Lovecraft. This is one of his novels, or collection of stories, I should say. He has many. And he was not successful when he was alive. He was mostly writing for what we call pulp magazines, popular magazines that focused on horror themes and the supernatural. But he's gained a lot of headway after he died, and much of his material has become very, very popular. Now, what does that have to do with the Necronomicon? So it turns out Lovecraft, in some of his writings, particularly his first book, or first publication of books, he has a story about this book, the Book of the Dead, or what he calls the Necronomicon. And it's supposed to be this ancient, powerful grimoire that can be used to tap into these dark spiritual forces. So Lovecraft in his universe picks up and uses the Necronomicon throughout many of his stories. And because of his popularity, a lot of other people in the genre have also picked up on the name of the Necronomicon and used it as well. Again, when Lovecraft was writing, it was a completely, supposedly fictional idea that he incorporated into his fictional stories. With that said, like all things when it comes to the occult, there's all this sort of speculation and guesswork because everything's very secretive and private. And there were some who believed that Lovecraft's idea of the Necronomicon may have actually been based on a real book. So it sort of became this sort of holy grail of esoteric literature. Okay. Well, lo and behold, in the 70s, someone, which we'll get to, claimed to have found a copy of the Necronomicon. It was published, it was released limitedly, and it sold out before it even hit newsstands, for lack of a better term. They'd already pre-sold all their copies before its release date, essentially. The person who is largely responsible for this is a man by the name of Peter Levenda. Okay, Levenda is a writer who's still around now. He does a lot of research journalism. He looks at things like, the various involvement of the Nazis in the occult. but other occult practices, even in the United States and other places. I've become a big fan of his work. I think he's an excellent resource. He's released a lot of his material in various capacities. They just re-released one of his books called Sinister Forces, which is a great one. But without going too deep into this story, the story that Lavinda claims, and he still supports this story, is that when he was a younger man, he was living in New York, and he was a person who frequented esoteric bookshops, and he was very into this type of stuff. He was also working in a religious capacity with, I believe it was the Russian Orthodox Church. It's a whole story unto itself, which I'm not even going to talk about. But either way, he had some connections with different clerical members throughout New York who worked in various churches. And one of these gentlemen he'd become friends with, and this man had a very, how shall I say this, impressive collection of esoteric literature, some old, hard to find books, which appealed to Lavinda. However, this clergyman who was collecting these books started to notice something peculiar, and that was he had this cellar or these sellers that he was buying these works from, and it seemed like they were getting a lot of stuff that was very hard to find, and he started to suspect that there was something more sinister going on, and that these guys might not be on the up and up. So he tasked Lavinda with a job. He said, "I want you to go to this shop, get to know these guys, try to figure out what's going on." So again, this is a man who becomes an investigative reporter and has many stories like this. He does this, and he befriends these guys running this bookshop. And before you know it, they actually kind of let him see the backdoor operation. And in fact, this is a very nefarious group of individuals who basically had been stealing valuable books from various places. Some were probably from private collections. Others were maybe like library copies and things that they were getting a hold of. And then in the back of the house, they were essentially removing any markings, stamping, imprints, writing that would connect those books to their proper owner. And then they were selling it essentially on the black market to book collectors. If you've ever seen the movie The Ninth Gate starring Johnny Depp, the character in that movie is actually based on Lavinda. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. Lavinda notifies his clergyman that he knows about his books and says, your concerns were valid. There is nefarious things taking place. They end up reporting these men to the police, and they're arrested. And apparently it was a pretty big news story about these guys selling illegal books. But what Lavinda claims is that in their collection, they had a handwritten document. I believe it was written in Greek. And he couldn't read the Greek, but he could read the name at the top of this document, and it said Necronomicon. Well, he thought that's fascinating. He was, of course, familiar with Lovecraft. So the story is they hired an expert to translate this handwritten document from Greek into English. And then when they read over it and looked at what it had to say, they believed it to be potentially authentic. Okay, like it was an actual copy of this alleged, seemingly fictional book, the Necronomicon. Either way, it was just a matter of time before they found a publisher who was willing to release it. And as I said, it became very popular and it sold a lot. Now, if you go look this up now, what you'll see is that most people, the general consensus, is that this was all an elaborate hoax put on by probably Lavinda and maybe some of his consorts. The idea being they knew there was an audience for this text, so they came up with this elaborate backstory about finding this mysterious document, and then, that it was authentic and real, and then selling it to the public. And it worked. Although, I will say, again, Lavinda still to this day has stuck to his story. He says, no, he found it. He doesn't know what it was. So someone said, well, maybe he didn't create it as a fake document. Maybe he did find it, but maybe someone else had created this fake document. Either way, it doesn't make any sense that there would be a real grimoire of a supposedly fictional novel, or excuse me, a fictional book known as a Necronomicon. But, like with all these stories, things get more interesting. If you know anything about a grimoire, it's essentially like a recipe book for witchcraft. It's a step-by-step process. I mean, it often includes vigils and symbols and things that are utilized to essentially perform various rituals. Some people in the occult who believed that this was factually true, and we're going to get to why in just a minute, started to use this as a grimoire to perform various occult activities, and they actually reported that they worked, hence believing that this was legitimate and or real. Now, I'll pause the story here and give my opinion on this. From my other discussions, for example, if you watch my demonology videos, I talk a lot about different occult practices. And one of the things that I find is true across the board is so much of this stuff, it's not related to the item itself, right? It's not the book that has the power. It's the intent. So again, if we look at other loaded things, other loaded objects, or other devices or things that are used for occult practices, oftentimes they're arbitrary, right? In a lot of the African Yoruba traditions, they may use anything from coconuts to bones of dead animals to puka shells. In the West, people just use playing cards or a deck of cards. Some people read tea leaves. All of these are just different ways where people essentially try to tap into the spirit realm. And if the intent is to do so, the intent is essentially opening a door. So from my standpoint, it would make sense that if people in the occult got a hold of a book like this, whether it was real or fictional, but they started practicing it with the intent, it would have the same effect as like a Ouija board, right? Like a Ouija board is just a board with letters and a planchette. It's made by, I think, Mattel, a toy company, but it can definitely be used for nefarious purposes. So it's possible that that's just the explanation. But there is another more interesting explanation, which gets to where I want to go with my discussion today. And that is related to a different individual by the name of Kenneth Grant. Okay. This is the first book. It's called The Magical Revival, and it's part of his Typhon trilogy. Okay. It's actually 3 sets of 3. So it's 3 books that came out in 3 different ways. So it ends up being a total of 9 total texts. One of the things that's true of people in the occult is they do a lot with like numerical values in numerology. We saw this to some degree when we talked about Santeria, some of my other videos, but the number of 333 is one that Aleister Crowley had used in his, I think, Book of Lies, one of his books, and it was actually linked to a specific entity or force that he had tapped into. We're going to talk about that later, but long story short, Kenneth Grant was a student of Crowley's. He was also a huge fan of H.P. Lovecraft. And when he started to learn Crowley's teachings, okay, and read some of his, I guess we'd call them prophetic writings, where he was having these sort of scrying sessions where he was interacting with demonic forces, he noticed that a lot of the names and even the descriptions of these entities that Crowley was encountering were eerily similar to entities that Lovecraft was talking about in his fictional stories. So Grant did this study of this and started looking this and started making these connections, and he came to a different conclusion, which is kind of what I want to get at in my discussion today. So I have a whiteboard here. Hopefully we can see it. If you think of, we've talked about how like in the Bible, Paul talks about the 3 heavens, right? There's the sort of earthly heaven, okay? And then there is what I would refer to as the second heaven, which is probably the spirit world, or what they would call in the occult the astral realm. And then, of course, there's the third heaven. This is where God is, okay? So this is like the astral. Sorry if my handwriting is sloppy here, people. I used to be a teacher, but it's been a while since I wrote on a whiteboard. And then this is just kind of earth, or whatever you want to call it, or the corporeal reality. So we look at our different things here. So I'm going to kind of see if I can get on this, and I probably won't all fit on there. But we have the sort of corporeal space where we live in. Then we have sort of the astral realm or the spirit realm, and then of course God's somewhere up here. Now, what Grant believed was that people, whether intentionally or unintentionally, would at times tap into the astral realm, and that there were things actively in that realm who were looking to participate with humans in the physical realm. Crowley was doing this intentionally because he was doing various occult practices and things in order to tap into this spirit realm, and he was getting in contact with entities, which we'll talk about later. What Grant proposes is that without his knowing it, perhaps, Lovecraft was doing the same thing. Now, Lovecraft claimed to be a agnostic or an atheist. He claimed not to have any actual religious belief systems. He just wrote all this, occult horror stuff in his fictional stories. But because of that, he was studying a lot of occult literature, particularly the writings of Madame Blavatsky, who we're going to talk about in a minute. So, what Grant proposed was whether Lovecraft was intending to do it or not, he had tapped into this astral realm. And he points to the fact that Lovecraft claims many of the characters and stories that he would have or that he would create came to him in dreams. Now, being an occultist, Grant knew this to be a way in which the astral realm, the spirit realm, can connect with people. So he used this as a way to explain why the entities, including their names, descriptions, etc., were the same, seemingly, as the ones that Crowley was interacting with, when we know for a fact that while Lovecraft and Crowley were alive at the same time, they were living in different places, and they never met each other, and they would not have had access to each other's writings yet, okay? And that's the point that Grant wants to make. So his conclusion is the only way that Lovecraft could have come up with these same experiences that he used in his fictional writings is because he, like Crowley, had tapped into the same astral realm. Now, let's bring this back to the start of this discussion, which is around the Necronomicon. One of the things we're going to find when we move forward is that there's a lot of different esoteric literature that's claimed to have provided people with all types of insight, right, that they use for their occult writings. But more often than not, these texts can't be found. Some, like Grant and others, have proposed that it's because these things don't exist in the physical world, but only exist in the spiritual realm, the astral realm. And that certain individuals who have the ability to tap into that can actually essentially be fed this information, and then they can write it down. So another possible interpretation of the Necronomicon is that it is a book in the astral realm, and that someone, we don't know who, was able to copy down this information and compile it into a real grimoire. I don't think that's the case, but again, this is where this stuff gets very fuzzy and weird, okay? Now, why do I share all that stuff with you? Well, it's going to come back up later. Just as another caveat, this is the book that Lavinda actually details this whole story I've just been telling you. It's called The Dark Lord. It's specifically, the subtitle is H.P. Lovecraft, Kenneth Grant, and the Typhonian Tradition in Magic, okay? So that's one of his writings. I'm going to set these books aside because I have a lot more I'm going to show you. So I'll set them over here. What's the point of this? The point is getting back to this idea. Whether you believe this or not, exactly. I'm sorry, there's a little bit of a reflection on my board here. That's my ring light. That's what that light is, if you're wondering. Is this idea that there's certainly people living in the corporeal space who are interacting with spiritual forces, and there tends to be overlap in what we see happening in various places. So I just used the example of Aleister Crowley and H.P. Lovecraft. What I'm proposing, what my hypothesis is the same thing. We can find the same thing when we look at what's taking place in the occult in early Western history, or not early Western, early American history. We're going to moving forward, and the development and foundation of what becomes the evangelical church. It may sound crazy, but that's why you're going to have to stick with me. But that's why I want to use this analogy. So the idea is that there's people down here tapping into spiritual things. The spiritual things are up here, and they're the same things that are interacting with people. They're just being manifest in different ways. So for Crowley, he was getting it through visions and scrying sessions and rituals. For Lovecraft, he was having dreams, and then he was documenting it in fictional stories. Hopefully all that makes sense. All right. I have a lot of notes because there's a lot of names and dates. This could be a long video, so apologies in advance because there's a lot of material here, but I do want to hit this home because I do think all of these points are valuable. So if we're going to talk about the evangelical church, we really have to start with the Protestant Reformation, okay? Because evangelicalism is a branch of Protestantism, okay? And it comes out of a lot of the central tenets of the Protestant Reformation. So if you know your history, you know that the Protestant Reformation takes place in 1917. Okay, this is when Martin Luther nails his 95 Thesis onto the door in Wittenberg, Germany, basically challenging a lot of the common perceived truths within the Catholic Church. He saw that there was problems. Okay, now just as another interesting point, and I didn't know this. This is what I said when I looked it up. So hopefully this is correct. And if it is, it's bizarre. But it's saying that the day that he actually nailed the theses on the door in Wittenberg was actually October 31st of 1917. Now, I find that interesting because that would, of course, be what we call Halloween. But that is a very important day in the pagan calendar. It's kind of the highest of all high days. And it's when a lot of very dark pagan activities occur. So it is peculiar, and there's a lot of peculiarity in all the discussion we're going to have today, that seems to be the same day that Luther would nail his theses on the door and challenge the Catholic Church. Now, I don't think that Luther was participating in any type of pagan ritual. I just find it peculiar that those dates match up. One of the central tenets, of the Protestant Reformation is this idea of sola scriptura. Okay, and the idea was that we want to just go back to the scriptures, right? Let's look at just what the Bible has to say. This is in response to the fact that the Catholic Church had incorporated so many different traditions and practices and even beliefs that weren't really anchored in the scriptures themselves. Okay, so this is one of the many things that Luther found problematic. He also had to go back, he and others, I should say, who start the Reformation, had to go back and revisit the scriptures because they came to the conclusion that some of the books that were in the Catholic Bible did not warrant being put in the Bible, meaning they didn't believe them to be inspired in the same way that other texts in the Bible are inspired. Most notably, this is what in the Protestant space they call the Apocrypha, okay, meaning that they believe these books were apocryphal. They weren't really what they claimed to be, and therefore shouldn't be in the Bible. Now, in the Catholic tradition, they don't call them the Apocrypha. They call them the Deuterocanonical, sorry, it's hard to say, books, versus the proto-canonical books. And the proto-canonical books are the older, Hebrew texts that we find in our common Bible, and then the Deuterocanonical writings. I hope I'm saying that right. It's hard to say. Stumbling over my words. These were some of the later texts that fell, a lot of them like in the intertestamental period, and that, again, the reformers believed shouldn't have a place in the scriptures. So they were removed. As far as the New Testament goes, there was debates because some people thought certain books were of questionable origin. Okay, so I think there was 4, if I remember correctly, and they were Hebrews, I think James, maybe Jude, and Revelation, the book of Revelation, which is going to be the primary point of this discussion. The book of Revelation had always been controversial. Luther, initially, in the early stages of the Reformation, was reticent to put the book of Revelation in the Protestant Bible because he thought it was a very difficult text to make sense of. He didn't really know what it meant, and he thought it often gets misused and misappropriated. But he eventually changes his tune because as the, let's say, religious war between the Catholics and Protestants gets dialed up and there's more pressure, Luther does what many have done since, and that is he starts to read the book of Revelation, and in it he sees his own current historical scenario, a scenario where there's turmoil and there's battles and there's wars waging, and most notably where there's a conflict within the religion, where there is this group of people who are the elect, who Luther views as the new Protestants, right? And then there's these others who are essentially those pretending to be the authentic, speakers for God. So this would be, of course, the Antichrist. And Luther actually goes so far as to claim that the Pope of the Catholic Church is the Antichrist and that he is trying to usher in the end times. Luther, of course, now sees himself and the reformers as those who are the elect, who are now propagating the proper tradition, so on and so forth. I think you get my point. But this is not the first time this will happen. and it starts to go down some really strange paths, which is what we're going to talk about. In order to get down that, we need to move from I'm sorry, I had 1917 for the Protestant Reformation. That is, I don't know if I said that because I was reading it. It would be 15 because it's the 1500s. So it would have been 1517 that happened. So I apologize if I misspoke. Sometimes I write things down wrong. That's actually the date that's related to Halloween. So now I'm questioning that date too. I'll go back after this video and I'll look it up again and just fact check myself because I make mistakes. And I'll put in the comments if it's incorrect. But it should be the year of 1517, not 1917, obviously. Okay, so the 1500s, there's a lot going on. Obviously, there's this battle between Catholicism and Protestantism. This is the time when Queen Elizabeth takes the throne in England, and she becomes and births sort of the Elizabethan era. So this is like the era of Shakespeare, just to give you some context. Certainly in Europe, this is sort of the emerging Renaissance era, where the West is starting to have a higher level of power and contributing more academically and things like this, and starts to become a broader influence globally, okay, which we're going to get to. So this brings us now out of the Christian space into the occult space, because what a lot of people may not know is that even though Queen Elizabeth was, at least on the surface, claiming to be a Christian and a believer in the Bible and things like that, she actually employed a alchemist or magician. His name was John Dee. This is now in 1582 to 1589 that we're going to be looking at. Dee started working for her before that. Now, Dee himself viewed himself as a Christian, okay, even though he was an alchemist and a magician. He did not tie himself to either tradition, whether they're Catholic or Protestant. Mostly, he just was looking for someone to fund his research. And during this time, this is when these alchemists were essentially trying to find a way to convert metal, some metals, into precious metals, particularly gold, because the idea was they're starting to learn chemistry, they're starting to learn about elements and things like this, although it's still very like kind of early stages of this. But they're learning this stuff, and they think that maybe if they figure this out, they can basically make gold, and then whoever figures out how to do that will become the richest, most powerful nation in the world. Dee never finds out how to make gold, but what he does start doing is performing scrying sessions with his fellow partner, who's a man by the name of Edward Kelly. Now, Edward Kelly is also an occultist who starts working with Dee, who seems to be gifted, or however you want to say it, with being able to sort of see or tap into the spirit world. Now, in this time in history, people had a much more robust belief in spiritual things than they do moving forward as we move further into the Enlightenment. So these things weren't out of hand at this point in time, per se. But the way that this was happening is they were doing scrying sessions where Kelly would look into a piece of obsidian and where there was a reflection, and he would use it, and he would have these visions. And it's basically the same idea we think of like a crystal ball, looking into a crystal ball or whatever it is. You can kind of use anything for this. In fact, Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, also did this, and this is how he had his visions and created the Mormon Church, just as a caveat. Fun little fact. So Edward Kelly and John Dee start doing this. And basically, Dee is documenting things, and he's performing various rituals and things. Kelly's doing the actual scrying where he's getting this sort of vision, and then Dee is recording all this stuff. And over the process of this several years they're working together, they tap into the spirit world, and they start to come in contact with entities. Now, these entities claim they're angels. And in fact, they appear initially as four. So there's the four you'd expect: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel. And from this, Dee takes the information that he's getting from these angelic beings, and he creates a system, or what comes to be known as Enochian magic. Okay, now Enochian comes from the book of Enoch, right, where there's these stories of these angels, fallen and holy, and this sort of spiritual battle that's going on between the spirit realm and the human realm. And so he calls this Enochian magic because he believes he's actually tapped into these angelic spirits. Okay, and the angelic spirits start providing Dee and Kelly with all kinds of information. A lot of it ends up being correct. But as I'm sure you can imagine, as time goes on, and as they continue to perform these rituals, the two men's lives start to unravel. They start to become chaotic and erratic, particularly Kelly, who is the one doing the scrying and having the visions, starts to suffer all kinds of serious mental health issues, amongst other things. He comes to the conclusion that these angelic beings aren't angels at all, but in fact, these are um, uh, demonic entities who are manipulating them and feeding them information and basically driving them insane. D is so tied to this, and his whole livelihood is based on this because he's basically working directly for the Queen of England, that he keeps pushing forward and keeps essentially forcing Kelly to continue to do these scrying sessions. Now, a couple strange things happen. Well, not a lot of strange things happen, but we're going to focus on a couple of them. One, this is the same time that the Americas are being discovered, right? Initially, that takes place largely through Spain and Portugal. But via these scrying sessions, D and Kelly get this vision from these Enochian angels that Great Britain, England, needs to get involved in the colonization of America. Because what these entities tell them is that this is going to be like the new Jerusalem. It's going to be like the next thing, and that they need to take control of it because they are still part of, loosely, the former Holy Roman Empire, and therefore they have like essentially a right to this and a right to perpetuate and continue the Christian tradition. He brings this idea to Queen Elizabeth, and she sanctions a trip by Captain Drake, if you know the story of Captain Drake, to go circumvent the globe and try to find out more and to start to look into the colonies. And it's for that very reason that England ends up settling in the colonies and taking control of the United States and the whole history of where the United States came from, which is a totally different subject matter. But all of this is because of these scrying sessions with these angels. Now, D also creates some things that's called the Four Watchtowers, or the Four Enochian Towers. These become foundational ideas in the occult, which we'll talk about later. But things start to unravel for both D and Kelly as things go along further. And it sort of reaches ahead, and this is a real story, so I'm going to share it with you, and it's going to be relevant later, when these angels tell D and Kelly that in order to proceed in their information, where they're being utilized to sort of bring forth or prophesize this information, they have to exchange wives and engage in sexual intercourse with each other's wives. Now, Kelly, of course, who has already come to the conclusion that these aren't angels, these are demons, is not on board with D on this. But D, again, is so committed to this that he thinks he has to do this. Before I tell you what happens there, I want to stop and tell about the other big important thing from this whole story. All of this is a result, according to these angels, of, again, end times. They basically communicate to D and Kelly that the world is entering into the final phase, the end times, Armageddon, as outlined in what? The book of Revelation. Now, in their case, they're claiming that it's not going to be a complete destruction of the earth, but rather the birthing of a new age. Okay, so you can already see the early forms of what becomes the New Age movement, and it influences all these different traditions. And so Kelly and D are essentially told that they are these special individuals who've been tasked with this great responsibility to sort of usher in the apocalypse, and that these scrying sessions that they're producing are precisely for that purpose. So D is taking this very seriously, right? Eventually, he convinces Kelly to wife swap with him. And I guess per journals and history, we learn that Kelly is actually able to consummate the relationship with Dee's wife. Dee is not able to consummate the relationship with Kelly's wife. We don't know why. Maybe there was impotency or something involved there. We don't know. But we do know that 9 months later, Dee's wife ends up having a child, and most people believe that it was probably Kelly's child, not Dee's. Either way, that's sort of the final nail in the coffin for these two. And what happens is Kelly decides to break ties with Dee, but before he does that, he essentially takes Dee's wife and all his money with him. And Dee is left to go back to England. At this point in time, they were living in Bohemia or Czechoslovakia, and he ends up being this sort of penniless wretch who never amounts to anything. Kelly goes on to still perform various occult tasks in Bohemia, and then his life goes on some dark turns as well. But we don't need to cover that. All this to say, this idea of one, colonialization, right, moving from England or Europe to the Americas, and this idea of the Revelation, the book of Revelation, and the end time being ushered in, and it actually being connected to the United States, all comes from these scrying sessions with Dee and Kelly. So keep that in mind. Oh, I should also mention one of the entities that they come in contact with, who they recognize as malevolent, is an entity by the name of Corazon, because that's an entity that Crowley later claims to also have encountered in his ritualistic magic acts. Okay, so now let's jump back to the Americas. Okay, so we've talked about the Protestant Reformation. We've talked about Dee and Kelly in the 1500s and their scrying sessions. When you get to America, there's another individual who becomes of some note. It's probably a name you're familiar with. Oh, this is a book about John Dee. It's called John Dee and the Empire of Angels. Okay, so this actually covers that whole backstory I just talked about if you look at the resources. So this is Cotton Mather's. Okay, this is actually Kenneth Silverman's book, which was award-winning biography of Mathers. And it tackles a lot of Mather's life. Now, you've probably heard the name Cotton Mather's before. He's most often associated with the Salem witch trials. And this is another one of those fun little facts. It's real strange. So we talked about Spain and Portugal and these other countries that were getting involved in moving to America. We certainly know that Christopher Columbus was the person who sort of is credited with discovering the America, although it's highly questionable. There's all kinds of other data that shows different things. But what we now know, according to records, is that truthfully, there was a reason why Columbus was looking for an alternative route to India. And it wasn't just for trade. He and his financiers, who fashioned themselves as Christians, were also trying to find a different way in to the Middle East with the anticipation and hope of recapturing Jerusalem. So essentially another crusade, right? So as we're coming out of sort of Middle Ages, which is when all the crusades are happening, and now moving into the Renaissance, that's seemingly over. But per what we now know, it seems that this was one of Columbus's intents, to try to find a backdoor into the Middle East so they could regain Jerusalem and have another crusade, so that the Christians would be in possession of Israel and Jerusalem. All of which relates to a lot of the stuff we're going to get into as well. But why I bring that up is because in these scrying sessions that Dee and Kelly have, they look at America as being sort of a new Jerusalem, or a new place for the Christian tradition to be birthed. Okay, and actually, Massachusetts, Boston is the first area that's settled, but the city of Salem is short for Jerusalem. So that's a fun little fact. Anyways, if you know the story of the Salem witch trials, this is probably where you've heard the name of Cotton Mather's. Now, he has a bad rap for this, and a lot of this history has been sort of reinterpreted over the years because a lot of people just don't believe in witchcraft. They don't believe that it's real. So they think that these were probably just misguided women. They were probably suffering from hysteria or whatever else. Okay, so it kind of just depends on your fundamental beliefs. But one of the things that it does come out now in the literature, and people like Silverman point this out and others, is that there's no question that there were women in Boston and Salem and some of the surrounding towns, which we're going to talk about in a second, who were participating in witchcraft. So it was happening. Now, what becomes more controversial and hard to distill is if all the people that were accused of participating in witchcraft were actually participating in witchcraft. And why that gets problematic is because it would seem that what was found out is that the people in charge who were prosecuting these women were using sort of inappropriate, nefarious ways to garnish confessions. And so we don't really know that these confessions were accurate. Now, Mathers gets lumped into that, but that's not actually correct. Turns out Cotton Mather's was never in Salem throughout this entire process. His story is a lot more interesting and related directly to what we're talking about today. So let me grab somewhere over here. Where is it? Here. I think I have my thing on Cotton Matters. Oh yeah, here we go. It's down here. Okay. So the reason why Mathers is contacted by the people in Salem and also another neighboring city called Andover. And it's actually contrary to what you may have heard. The city of Andover is the one that ends up having more people convicted of witchcraft and hanged or killed because of it. So it actually isn't Salem, although Salem is the one that people point to, and there was some there as well. But Mathers was a very prominent figure. He was a Puritan minister. He was very prolific. He came from a long line of very prominent ministers. His father, Increase, who is still living, Increase Mathers is his name, was also present and prominent. And so he was kind of a person that people looked to get insight on. And Mathers ended up writing a book, and he essentially promoted his opinion on this. And a lot of people were surprised at what he claimed because, first and foremost, it contradicted his father's writings on this, but also because it sort of validated some of this behavior that more or less most people in hindsight believed was done in poor taste, okay, for lack of a better term. But let me go back. Essentially what happened with Cotton Mathers is he was in Boston, so again, not Salem. He had an incident in his local church area. It involved a woman. She was an Irish woman, a Gaelic woman. She spoke Gaelic. Her name was Goody Glover, and she was in the care of some young children. The family's name was Goodwin. It's confusing because the woman's name is Goody, her first name, Goody Glover, and she was taking care of the Goodwin children. The children start to have strange paranormal experiences. Most notably, one of the daughters is a young girl. I think she was 13, and her name is Martha. Okay. Well, this comes before people like Mathers. They bring this concern up that this Goody Glover woman seems like she might be a witch, and that she's teaching or maybe introducing these young girls to, witchcraft. So Mathers has to get involved. And in the case of Goody Glover, she does confess. She says yes. She says she's doing witchcraft, and they're able to find clear evidence of that. So it's kind of an open shut case. Now Mathers feels bad for this young girl, Martha, so he actually takes her into his home to observe her and to basically pray for her. He's fasting, kind of essentially perform what we might refer to as like deliverance ministry, or even like, in the Catholic tradition, like he's trying to basically exorcise these demons. But he's also observing the girl. And after observing her, he comes to the conclusion that there's no doubt she was under demonic possession. And this is based off things he actually witnesses with his eyes. He starts to see things that are paranormal that he cannot explain other than through some type of demonic involvement. And as a result of that, he begins to change his thinking around the spirit world. Okay. And he starts to realize that this is more real than what he thought. And he also starts looking into this and starts seeing, in his opinion, that a lot of these actions, these witchcraft and demonic oppression, is far more prevalent than he even realized. So when the people in Salem and Andover are looking for insight into how to handle the situation, they reach out to Mathers. And Mathers actually doesn't deny the possibility that this could be witchcraft. In fact, he thinks it probably is. He believed that there probably was an actual witches' coven in Andover. Now, what Mathers doesn't do is promote any type of nefarious, or harmful treatment of these women in order to get confessions. What he does say is the best evidence is if the individual confesses themselves, because that's exactly what Goody Glover did. Because he said it's a very confusing space; it's hard to know. So again, on paper and in hindsight, Mathers handled the situation pretty well. But unfortunately, the people in Andover and Salem didn't take Mathers' advice in terms of how to gain the confessions. They used very sort of dark, heinous methods, essentially what we call torture. And of course, these women confessed, and then they were sentenced to death or whatever the various punishments were. And that's where we get this sort of dark history around Salem. But what's more important to this is this interaction with Martha Goodwin and the demonic possession she experiences, because Mathers has another situation like this some years later, with this would be in 1692, with a young girl named Mercy Short. Mercy Short is also living in the area where Mathers is serving as a minister, and people bring her forward because she also seems to be under some type of demonic influence. And Mathers brings her into his home. He does the same thing that he did with Martha Goodwin, and he observes her. And in her case, he sees even more bizarre paranormal things occurring in his house. And this young woman is even able to predict things and tell him things that he knows there's no way of her knowing. Okay, getting back into sort of this idea of tapping into the astral realm. And essentially, she's getting this information from whatever these entities are, these malevolent entities who are in possession of her. But where this takes a turn to go even different is that at one point in time, after Mathers is doing all his sort of things, praying for this young girl and fasting and all this kind of stuff, she comes to him one day, and she or I think he actually witnesses it, if I remember correctly. She has a vision. Now he doesn't see what she sees, but he sees her, I think, go into an ecstatic state. I may be misremembering, but either way, this girl has this vision, and she claims that she sees an entity, but this entity is, beautiful and glowing and all covered in white. And in this young girl claims it was an angel, and she says that this angel tells her that she's going to be healed of her afflictions on a specific date, which is like, I don't know how far from the date it was, but like on this date, all these malevolent forces are going to leave, and I'll be back to normal. And sure enough, that date comes along, and sure enough, she is relieved of whatever these malevolent forces were, and she goes right back to being normal. And after observing her for some time, Mathers releases her, and she goes back to her family, and apparently never had any issues again. Well, this gets Mathers further interested in this, because he's thinking, well, if there is malevolent entities out there and they can possess people and do all these things that we've seen in these various examples of witchcraft, in this case, it seems that there's also angelic spirits that can also be tapped into to gain information. And this is when Cotton Mather's life takes a dark turn in the wrong direction, because he starts to become obsessed with wanting to communicate with angels. Sound familiar? Sound like a little bit like John Dee and Edward Kelly? So he sets about fasting and praying and hoping that he'll get this angelic visitation. And sure enough, in 1685, make sure my dates are right here, Mathers has his first of what will be many angelic visions. Now, here's where this also gets interesting. Mathers realizes that angels are secretive, at least he claims, and they don't like to be made public. So he basically colludes in his mind with these spirits that he'll keep this stuff secret. And one of the ways that he does this is when he records things in his journal, he does it in Latin so that his wife and family can't read it, because he could read and write multiple languages. And so now we have this sort of idea of secret knowledge, right? So now he's trying to communicate with the astral realm. He thinks it's angels, like John Dee and Edward Kelly. He thinks it's this sort of secret process that only elect are allowed to gain access to, and he is one of those elect, like Dee and Kelly. And he ends up becoming what? Fascinated with the book of Revelation, because one of the things, the primary thing that this angelic spirit communicates to him is that he is a uniquely suited individual, and that he is going to help usher in what? The end times. And that this witchcraft that's coming from various places and being enforced in the colonies is part of this sort of end time tribulation, and that he, as sort of the stalwart of the community, is going to have to sort of step up and sort of become this prominent and important figure. Okay, great importance. And they say he's going to be the most published writer of his generation, all of which comes true, at least that part. Mathers ends up being the most published writer of that time. And that's why he's still to this day considered a very important historical figure. But from these angelic visions, he concludes that the end times, right, the apocalypse, or whatever you want to call it, the final days, sorry, my phone here is going to mess up probably, are going to occur in the year of 1716. Of course, we know that doesn't happen. All right, well, this video has gone on for 50 minutes, and I have only scratched the surface on this. So this is a lot of information. I am going somewhere with this, but I think I'm going to have to stop here so that my phone doesn't die, and I'll have to turn this into part 2, because it's just going to be too long otherwise. And I wasn't sure how long this would be when I got started. I never really know. I thought maybe I could get it all in one video, but it looks like I'm going to have part 2. So we're going to pick up with part 2, and we're going to start learning about a man by the name of John Nelson Darby and the Plymouth Brethren. So stay tuned for that. I will be filming that video shortly, and it'll probably be posted not long after this one. All right, thanks for watching.